Good morning and welcome to episode 81 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue. Today I'm joined, as I am each Friday, by Hacker of Hacker After Dark, which you can catch on 1010XL and 92.5 each weekday from 8 to 10 p.m. Hack, I know you had a good guest on last night talking to the founder of Spotrac, going over some contract details for the Jaguars, which is very noteworthy, newsworthy right now because yesterday the Jaguars did release Christian Kirk, Evan Engram, center Mitch Morse retired. They also let go of receiver Josh Reynolds, cornerback Ronald Darby. I feel like there might be one other one that I'm missing. But really the big three moves from yesterday from Jacksonville were Mitch Morse, Evan Engram, and Christian Kirk, who are all starters in week one last year, no longer being with the team. So, Hacker, today we're going to be talking about free agency fits for the Jaguars since the free agency NFL period opens next Monday. The tampering opens on Monday. But before we get to players we'd like to see add, just what was your reaction yesterday in terms of seeing those three particular players not being with the team anymore?
You know, next month will be 3 years for me in the 8 o'clock time slot. Normally by like 5 or 6 o'clock, I have a pretty solid game plan for what I'm going to do. And in the last 3 years, there's probably been 2 or 3 instances I can think of that I had to change things on the fly until the last 8 weeks. And in the last 8 weeks, I've had to change things on the fly quite a bit. I mean, it has been a wild 2 months since the Jaguars last played a football game. And yesterday with the Mitch Morse news, I thought, all right, that's pretty good. And then the Christian Kirk news broke. And I'll tell you a funny story. Cecil Shorts, former Jaguar, former Texan, I was literally recording an interview with him as the Kirk news broke that Jacksonville was trading him to Houston. So we literally got Cecil's raw reaction last night, which was cool. But then Ingram, Darby, Duvernay, I think Josh Reynolds, just whoa. I mean, you talk about a purge, man. You talk about a wiping of the slate. What an indictment of Trent Baalke and the free agents he brought in last year. It's obvious that Gladstone and Cohen want to make this their own, and they've established that now pretty quickly.
Right. Now, before we do get on to some free agent fits, just were you surprised by the news? Or obviously, I think hands up for everyone at 1010XL. I'm certainly not the only one that was alone in thinking that the Jaguars might cut Engram or Kirk, but I didn't expect both to happen. But with that said, I'm a little bit surprised, but I also don't think it's a good move. Just what do you think about it in terms of a football standpoint? Just because to me, Engram and Kirk definitely good players, but I think they're kind of like niche role players. And yesterday on the show, me and I were talking about how versatility is just so important in Cohen's offense. And I guess I just don't think that they're versatile enough, and seems like they didn't think that either. But are you a little bit miffed by the decision at all?
No, I mean, maybe a little surprised that both are gone, but at the end of the day, Gus, they're 5-18, man, in their last 23 games. I mean, that's where they are. They're the worst organization in football in the last year and a half. So am I going to lose sleep that Evan Engram, who's going to be 31 years old in September and started having some real injury problems last year at age 30, am I going to be, losing sleep that he's gone? No. Christian Kirk, kind of the same thing. Good player, nice guy. I think he's going to help Houston. And people were so funny, like, oh, they traded him to somebody in the division. Well, okay, yeah, they did. But they were going to flat out release him, right? And was there a bylaw in the NFL contracts that Houston could not sign Christian Kirk after he was released? I mean, odds are Houston was going to sign him anyway, or certainly make a good offer for him.
Right.
So you get a ham sandwich, right? You get a 7th round pick in 2026 as opposed to getting nothing. I just love people that say, well, they traded him in the division. Well, okay. If they released him and Houston signed him, then what would you say? So whatever.
I forgot that even happened, honestly. Yesterday was just such a whirlwind that I forgot that, Kirk was, quote-unquote, planning to be cut by the Jaguars, but then he ended up getting traded to the Texans for a 7th-round pick. That's, objectively a win for the Jaguars because they got something instead of nothing, so I don't really understand the backlash. Even if he is going to a division rival, Kirk is, from Texas, so it makes sense for a fit for him personally.
And you know what's funny about that? It's $16.5 million on the Texans cap, which means now they're not in the DK Metcalf sweepstakes or the Cooper Kupp sweepstakes or the, whoever, Chris Godwin sweepstakes. They've kind of gotten their free agent wide receiver in Christian Kirk, and they've taken all $16.5 million. Just something to think about.
Yeah, I think it was an okay move for the Texans if you're just looking at like bringing in a weapon for CJ Stroud. But then when you consider the money and exactly your point, which is like now that we've allocated money to this player, we don't really have it anymore to be able to allocate it to a DK Metcalf or a Cooper Cup or a whoever. So yeah, that's definitely a good point. I think that was definitely a clear win for the Jaguars in that trade. But it'll be interesting to see Kirk twice a year next year in Houston and then in Jacksonville against Houston. But to move on into potential replacements and even beyond like center, wide receiver, tight end, really the whole roster. But let's start with pass catchers. So either receiver or tight end. Are there any free agent names out there that interest you in terms of bringing them in before the draft to fill that hole?
There are a few that interest me. I don't know how realistic they are. Like I think Mike Gesicki in Cincinnati is a guy that's of interest to me. Decent blocker, good receiving option. Kind of really came on towards the end of last year in Cincinnati. Was thought really highly of in Miami. Went to New England, didn't do very much, but kind of had a resurgence last year in Cincinnati. That would be the one tight end. But again, there's not many tight ends out there that I don't think they're gonna bring in. I think it's gonna be more of a draft related situation. Hollywood Brown is the guy that I don't think we're talking about enough. Everybody's talking about how old this free agent class is. And right, Mike Williams, Keenan Allen, Amari Cooper, Stephon Diggs, DeAndre Hopkins, they're all 30 plus. Hollywood Brown was thought of in really high regard in Baltimore, goes to Kansas City on a 1 year deal and gets hurt in the preseason opener here in Jacksonville. And it's like people forgot about him. He comes in at the very end for Kansas City, does a little bit, but really was a forgotten season. He is a free agent, at least as we're talking right now. That's a guy that would interest me a little bit. I'll tell you, the Chris Godwin thing is interesting, Gus, and I'm not sure if you've heard this. I would imagine you have, as active as you are and as much as you know, but there's legit concern about his ankle in Tampa. If you talk to people around the Buccaneers, there's concern that that ankle injury last year might be worse than's being let on, which is causing them to wonder if they need to sign him long term. But obviously, that's going to affect his market in free agency. He's 29 with an ankle injury that may be worse than being let on. So I don't know if I'm in the Godwin sweepstakes necessarily. Cooper Kupp's interesting, but again, he's going to be 32 in November. Injury issues, expensive. We're not talking about Hollywood Brown, and I'm not really sure why. That's a guy I would look at.
I think that's a great point, especially because I mentioned on yesterday's show, like they definitely need kind of a replacement for slot, and I think Chris Godwin or Cooper Kupp would fit that to a T in terms of the versatility, being able to work inside and out, being able to be a pseudo tight end and be a real contributor, blocking and in the run game. But also on top of that, they definitely need a speed element because they don't want like Brian Thomas to be pigeonholed into like the deep vertical role to open up other players. Like you need a player to be able to open up a little bit of space for Brian Thomas. And so I do think that's a good shout. I personally like Darius Slayton a little bit more, the Giants free agent, but Hollywood Brown definitely a good shout. My concern with Gesicki is that I think he's pretty similar to Engram, like two objectively good starting caliber NFL tight ends, but they're both like almost cosplaying as slot receivers and aren't much of like inline blockers. And so if the Jaguars let go of Engram, I like maybe it was more of a cost decision and they would be interested in bringing in a similar mold, but I'll be a little bit surprised by that. But as you said, like Gesicki is really the only interesting free agent name out there at tight end. The only other one I think a lot of people would know would be Jawan Johnson from the Saints, but he was like an undrafted wide receiver coming into the league and transitioned to tight end, and he's been battling some injuries. So that's definitely a wild card. One under the radar name that I had is Johnny Munt from Minnesota, just because he's got the connection with Grant Udinski from the Vikings. But that would be more so like a Luke Farrell replacement because Luke Farrell is going to be a free agent for the Jaguars, and they could bring him back, but Johnny Munt would be kind of like a third string type blocking tight end that keep an eye out for to potentially replace Luke Farrell. But I do think that ultimately for the tight end position, it's going to be probably Brenton Strange and then a draft pick and maybe a cheap signing. And then for the wide receiver room too, maybe Chris Godwin or Cooper Kupp comes to town. But if neither of them do, I wouldn't be surprised if they just kind of roll with Brenton Strange and Parker Washington and Gabe Davis and kind of try to load up in the draft. So we'll see with the pass catchers, but I think that with Mitch Morse retiring and Brandon Sheriff heading to free agency, you now have two starting spots that need to be filled on the offensive line. And so I think they definitely need to have fill at least one of those two spots in free agency. And so, what interior offensive line names stick out to you, Hacker, that the Jaguars should be interested in?
Is it Austin Corbett, the center from Carolina? Because
Yeah.
he's got ties with Cohen, I believe, from the Rams days, and then Will Freeze. And again, I'm not breaking any news with Will Freeze, but he's a guy that I like. And it was interesting that he got hurt here. I think he broke his, was it an ankle injury here in Jacksonville in Week 5 for the
Yeah.
Colts, and didn't play again.
Yeah.
And I would bring in, I mean, those two are, everybody's talking about Mekhi Becton, right? And I get it. I don't know if he would leave Philadelphia. We'll see. And what's interesting about Becton is he was thought to be a bust prior to last year, and then he moves inside and has turned out to be a pretty good guard. But I think Corbett and Freeze are guys that I'm certainly looking at. I think they're going to bring in two offensive linemen. They might draft two because, again, you look at the depth on this team, right? One thing we got to remember, and I'm not telling you this, I mean, it's just like a rhetorical we have to remember. Gladstone and Cohen didn't draft any of these guys, and they didn't sign any of these guys. So are they going to be loyal to Cooper Hodges? Are they going to be loyal? The fourth rounder out of Missouri last year, his name's escaping, the tackle. I mean, are they going to be loyal? Yeah, Foster. Are they going to be loyal to Foster? Who knows? They didn't draft him. They didn't sign any of these guys. So I think you're going to sign two free agents. And of the 10 draft picks, it wouldn't surprise me if two of them are offensive linemen. I think 4 new linemen are going to be on this team, starters and backups in some capacity.
Yeah, love the Will Freeze. I think it's Fries. I'm not sure. But Will Fries from Indianapolis, as you said, he had a season-ending injury in Jacksonville last year, but I think he's been one of the more underrated guards in the league for a couple of years now. He's definitely got like the intangibles and the finishing ability that the Jaguars would be interested in. And so, yeah, I think
keep in mind, Gus, I've been on Awaken 180 for over a year. The term fries has escaped my vocabulary, so I'll try to work it back in.
Yeah, that makes sense. Mekhi Becton, I think, is really interesting, and I wouldn't hate bringing him in, but I am just like a little bit. I don't know that I would want to be the team that bets on him in a non-Jeff Stoutland offense. Stoutland is the legendary offensive line coach for the Eagles. And on top of that, Mekhi Becton got to play next to a future Hall of Fame right tackle in Lane Johnson. And so Jacksonville definitely doesn't have quite that infrastructure. I think that their offensive line staff is kind of a relative unknown, honestly, one of the biggest unknowns of anyone on the staff. And then plus, like, they have some nice pieces on the offensive line, but now that Morris and Sheriff are leaving, it's not a very experienced offensive line. And so I like Mekhi Becton in a vacuum, but I just don't know if he's a great fit for Jacksonville. The one other name that I was thinking of is Ben Brederson from the Bucs. He signed a 1-year deal last year. Turned out to be pretty versatile. He can play guard on either side. He's a little bit shorter arms, like not the greatest strength, so he doesn't have the best anchor, but he does make up for those deficiencies with like his just caliber of play, the style of play, by like always finishing and like kind of making up ground just with his style of play. Hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, and so I think that would make sense as kind of like a lower tier guy that like could be a starter if you really need him to, but ideally you would have him probably compete with a rookie to be the starting right guard. And then yeah, center. It's kind of like the tight end position where it's like there's really only 2 notable names, and I don't even know if either of them are really that good of fits in Jacksonville. So I'm kind of assuming that the Jaguars will look to the draft for the center, but I do like the Austin Corbett shout for sure.
One of the interesting things, everybody's into mock draft simulators this time of year. We were talking about Spot Track last night. I had the founder, Mike Giannetti, on. Really smart guy, salary cap, all this. What that website does is they do a free agent. You can like manage a team's off season. It's kind of like a simulator, but you can sign free agents and stuff. Check it out if you haven't. It's cool. And I did it this morning, and with $60 million of cap room. Now they have, when you click on guys, you can give them a custom contract, or you can give them the market value, and that's what I stuck with, the market value. You can sign an entire draft class, and I signed 7 unrestricted free agents plus my entire draft class, and I still had $13 million under the cap. So I think it's going to be very active for Jacksonville beginning Monday.
With that said, where do you expect them to spend? I feel like we got through most of the offensive positions, and so where on defense do you think that they should or will end up spending the most money?
I think you bring in a third edge guy. I think I brought in DeMarcus Walker on the spot track and bring him home
Okay.
from bring him back to Jacksonville. I think, or Quentin Farrell's another guy that I thought might be worth kicking the tires on. So I think you bring in a third edge, which again, now that Trent Baalke's here, is almost definite because Baalke was just immune to bringing in a guy that could play behind Walker and Allen, and then safety, maybe two, and certainly at least one corner. I doubt they address linebacker. I don't know why you would, right? With Devin Lloyd, Foye, and Ventrell Miller. But again, these are not Gladstone and Cohen's guys or Campanile's guys. So we'll see how they feel about linebacker. But on the surface, linebacker appears pretty deep. But I think at least one edge rusher, at least one safety, at least one corner, and then you see where you are at that point.
Yeah, I definitely expect them to fill the safety role because I think that's probably the biggest just apparent need in terms of a starting spot with Andre Cisco hitting free agency and not expected to return to the team. You definitely need someone to replace him, and it's harder to find guys like with the range and the middle field ability to cover a large area of the field than it is to find like box safeties and guys that play closer to the line of scrimmage, I think. So there's not really a lot of those guys available. But at the same time, safety is a pretty like undervalued position, or at least relatively underpaid. And so it'll be interesting to see how much the Jaguars do kind of break the bank at that position specifically, like whether they're all in on Javon Holland or if they're kind of more so interested in kind of like second tier starters in the second wave of free agency.
See, I signed Morig on Spot Track. Holland was really expensive, but I went Morig from Vegas, who I remember, if memory serves, a lot of people here in Jacksonville wanted us to draft him anyway a couple of years ago.
Yeah, he was a second rounder out of TCU. I guess that was probably the same draft class as Andre Cisco, and they just ended up with Cisco if they're both going to be free agents right now.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that Vegas didn't bring him back because I think he did really well last year in Patrick Graham's scheme. And yeah, I think that after Holland, he's like the next guy on my list. And in terms of like value, because Morig will probably sign smaller contracts, like he might end up being a better value than Javon Holland. But that'll be interesting to see. I'm also interested in seeing like what caliber of cornerback that I sign, because if they go out and get like a Carlton Davis from the Lions or a DJ Reed from the Jets, then they were obviously knew that they need to fill a hole at perimeter cornerback opposite Tyson Campbell. But then if they don't do that, then I wonder if that means that when they look at the roster, they're thinking that Jarian Jones could potentially play outside in addition to being their main slot guy. And so are there any interior defensive linemen that stick out to you? Because I've got one name that I really, really like, and I do think that that's a position that makes sense to fill in free agency.
Yeah, again, whatever they do in free agency will have a direct relation to what they do in the draft. I mean, I'm of the opinion that one of the two Michigan D linemen is coming to Jacksonville, either Graham or Grant, maybe in round 2. So I didn't address that when I did the NFL Manage deal earlier today. It would not surprise me, though. But if you think about it, Devon Hamilton, Eric Armstead, and Mason Smith, Jordan Jefferson, I guess, Ledbetter's a free agent. I certainly think via draft or via free agency, they are going to work on the interior D line, but I did not add anybody when I did my free agent mock earlier.
There was going to be a lot of interesting veteran guys out there. I mean, Calais Campbell is a free agent, but also Jonathan Allen from the Commanders, Grady Jarrett from the Falcons. I think both of those guys are going to end up getting cut before next week. I feel like there was one other name that I was thinking of too. But the name that I really like is already a free agent from the Cincinnati Bengals, BJ Hill. He's just like a 30-year-old vet who can line up at a couple different spots. He kind of reminded me of Roy Robertson Harris, honestly, watching him on film, just because he's so big and towers over even fellow defensive linemen. And so he's got a little bit of pass rush juice, but really he's just like a steady veteran presence, steady role player who's a little bit better as like a kind of two-gap or run stopper, but certainly can be like a penetrating defensive lineman. And so I just think that he'd be like just a very steady veteran role player, which is exactly what that position needs as they move into the draft. So Hacker, I feel like that was a great show, but are there any other names that you had been thinking of or any other thoughts that you have as we wrap up?
No, I think we hit it all. The only one that I didn't mention is I signed Kyle Trask when I did the free agent thing, because again, I don't know about Mac Jones. Kyle Trask has familiarity in Cohen's system from last year in Tampa. Again, how important, if any backup quarterback is playing in 2025, the season's off the rails. But, for what it's worth, former Gator, I had them bringing in Trask just because he knows Cohen's system from Tampa.
No, I love that. At first I was like looking at backup quarterbacks and just looking for the most experience possible. But I do think that in 2025 specifically, like the best possible answer at backup quarterback would be Kyle Trask to kind of help translate or teach Trevor Lawrence Liam Cohen's offense. Mm-hmm. And then beyond that, maybe you do look for more of a guy that's been around the league for a decade plus, if there are any of those guys available for cheap. But yeah, I definitely love the Kyle Trask connection free agency. Just go over some comments before we get out here. Floyd says Bobby Brown's from the Rams is worth a look. Someone else earlier said, Harv said on YouTube, trade for Michael Mayer. Cohen can make him relevant like he did with Otten. I would like trading for Michael Mayer. I feel like he's dealt with some off the field stuff in his time with Vegas, but obviously the Raiders have Brock Bowers as their starter. And I do think that Mayers is the kind of guy that'll have the versatility that Cohen likes, where he can be an inline run blocker. You can even flex him out wide like Engram was at times last year. I think he can line up in a bunch of different spots, and I loved him as a prospect coming out of Notre Dame. So I would certainly be interested in floating a 4th or 5th round pick for him.
Yeah, I like the Mayer idea. Was it the texter Bobby Brown from the Rams? Is that what he said?
Mm-hmm.
I love that guy. I remember when I covered recruiting, because Brown went to A&M.
Oh yeah.
I remember at the Under Armour game, and I covered recruiting for like 3 years on a Southeastern level. Man, I talked to Bobby Brown like 5 or 6 times. I bet I still have his number in my cell phone. That's a cool dude. I didn't know he was a free agent. That's my guy. I would love for the Jaguars to bring in Bobby Brown, if for no other reason than I just really enjoyed talking to him during his high school recruitment.
Absolutely. What position does he play? I've never heard of him, honestly.
He's like a DeMarcus Walker type. He can be inside and can be outside, kind of a tweener. He's a good player. I think, I followed him a little bit with the Rams just because, again, I was very familiar with him in high school. He makes plays. I'd be curious to see his stat line, but I love that idea.
Sweet. All right. Good shout, Floyd. Appreciate everyone in the comments. Appreciate you, Hacker, for coming in each Friday. Yeah, that'll do it. Hope everyone has a good weekend. Looking forward to the start of free agency next week. We'll be back on Monday at 9:04 a.m. I'll have a fresh pre-free agency mock draft for you guys, and then we'll get into all the player transactions that are to come. So, again, have a good weekend. Hack, thank you. Peace out, everyone.